12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
July 20th, 1969.
Nhưng chờ chút đã, có điều gì đó kỳ lạ. Một ký tự được đánh dấu sẵn.
Resembling a prop code on a Hollywood movie set. From a pitch black sky without a single star, and the strange casting of shadows to the wire-suspended movements of the astronauts. All of this remains an endless debate among astronomy enthusiasts. So, what is the actual truth? Exactly at 1650 on July 24th, 1969.
Over 100 foreign governments, emperors and presidents and prime ministers and kings have sent the most warm messages that we've ever received. They represent over 2 billion people on this earth, all of them who have had the opportunity through television to see what you have done.
That moment seemed to close a decade-long space race, and finally, the U.S. had crossed the finish line first. But while the whole world was still basking in the glory, somewhere else, a completely opposite thought was forming. Bill Kaysing. He was the head of technical publications at Rocketdyne, the company that built the F-1 engines for the rocket that sent Apollo 11 to the moon. Yet, Kaysing believed the astronauts never left Earth. Everything the world witnessed was just a perfect performance. After that historic day on July 20th, Kaysing started going around, claiming he was being followed, threatened, and targeted by intelligence agencies. At the time, his accusations were quickly forgotten. Most people thought he was just paranoid, trying to grab attention after a monumental event. That was until 1976, when Kaysing published his book. For the first time, all the suspicions about the moon landing being staged were fully and systematically laid out. The idea sounded crazy, but it dropped right at a time when the American public's trust was severely shaken. In 1960, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down while flying over Soviet airspace. Initially, Washington denied it, claiming it was just a weather research plane. But when the Soviet Union released evidence and the surviving pilot's confession, the truth was exposed. The incident not only embarrassed the US government but also collapsed the Paris summit, pushing Cold War tensions to a new level. Then, in the early 1970s, the Watergate scandal broke out. It all started with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee, headquarters by people tied to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. What truly outraged the public was the massive cover-up that followed. As layers of information were peeled back, the truth gradually emerged, bringing a flood of serious allegations involving corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
In 1974, Nixon was forced to resign to avoid impeachment. While many high-ranking officials faced criminal charges, the Pentagon Papers were leaked around the same time. This was a 7,000-page top-secret Department of Defense study regarding the Vietnam War. It exposed the government's lies, showing how they secretly escalated military involvement in Southeast Asia. These consecutive shocks made citizens start asking, how much more truth is being hidden from us. In that context, Kaysing's theory wasn't seen as crazy anymore. It gradually became a reasonable doubt, especially since he and his supporters didn't rely on classified documents. They looked at exactly what had been released to the public. The footage and photos of humanity's historic trip were scrutinized, especially in the internet age. Anyone could analyze them, and every weird detail became evidence. And when information could no longer be controlled, the truth became harder to pinpoint than ever. In 2002, a surprising event made these accusations blow up. A conspiracy theorist filmmaker ambushed Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. Aldrin was repeatedly accused of lying about the Apollo 11 landing.
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
The moment was caught on camera, went viral, and instantly became a global debate. Buzz Aldrin's punch might be a completely understandable reaction from a hero being insulted. But for the skeptics, it was interpreted as a sign of a cover-up. Why get so angry and lose control if the truth is undeniable? Conspiracy theorists began digging through the entire archive, dissecting every single piece. The skepticism started with the biggest core weakness: technical limitation. According to them, 1960s technology was way too primitive to pull off such an impossible mission. The navigation systems and computers back then were so bulky they took up an entire room. Their processing power was far weaker than today's smartphones. Even simulating gravity outside of Earth was a massive challenge. Data on the moon's terrain and gravitational field was extremely limited. Maps were severely lacking in information, and many variables were not fully understood. Even with detailed data, the computers could only barely handle the mission under perfect, ideal conditions. And of course, reality is never perfect. Just 14 months before Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong tested a lunar landing training vehicle. Mid-flight, the system suddenly malfunctioned, causing the craft to lose control completely. This terrifying incident made people wonder if a simulator on Earth was so unstable it almost killed their best astronaut. How incredibly risky would it be to land the real thing on the moon? Even scarier, NASA had absolutely no rescue plan if the landing went wrong. Yet, despite all those technical hurdles, NASA brought back footage and photos that were absurdly perfect. Ralph Rene was a professionally trained photographer in the 1960s. He had a lot of experience with specialized cameras like the Hasselblad and high-end color film of that era. The more Rene looked at the photos, the more he doubted them. He raised a simple technical question about the spacesuit gloves. Rene tested this himself in a vacuum chamber. When the air is sucked out, the pressure difference causes the gloves to inflate and become incredibly stiff. Moving your fingers is nearly impossible. So how could the astronauts perform delicate tasks like turning screws or pressing camera buttons with hands that were essentially paralyzed? Other researchers looked at the materials. They doubted the film rolls could survive the trip. The harsh vacuum and extreme temperature swings in space should have completely destroyed that fragile plastic material. But let's say the magical film survived and brought pictures back to Earth. What was actually in the frame raised even more red flags. According to many, since the moon has no atmosphere, space should appear with millions of stars, shining brighter than ever. But Apollo's photos showed the exact opposite. Bill Kaysing argued this was a deliberate choice. NASA's directors intentionally left the stars out because faking a star map was too risky. Astronomers would easily spot incorrect star placements. Furthermore, the sun is the only light source on the moon. Logically, the shadows of all objects should be parallel. But in many photos, the shadows of the rocks and the lunar module intersect in multiple directions. This was seen as clear proof of multiple artificial studio lights. Look at this photo. You can see Buzz Aldrin standing completely in the dark shadows, yet his suit is brightly lit as if a spotlight is shining directly on him. Even the American flag was weird. The moon has no air, so why was it waving? Conspiracy theorists argued there was only one explanation. The moon landing footage was shot in slow motion in a studio that required a massive amount of lighting. These lights generated extreme heat, forcing them to use heavy-duty cooling fans on set. It was the breeze from these fans that accidentally blew the flag. When the camera zoomed out to capture the grand scale of the event, people pointed out a massive hole in the story right on the ground. There was no blast crater. According to them, the module's descent engine exerted hundreds of tons of thrust to slow down. Yet beneath it, there wasn't a single crack or dent. Even the lunar dust right under the landing pads was perfectly flat, completely undisturbed. It looked as if the heavy machine was gently placed there by a giant crane. Even the human movements were targeted. Footage showing Buzz Aldrin moving around with a kangaroo hop became iconic. Aldrin explained it looked that way because of the bulky suit. But analyzing the footage closely, conspiracy theorists insisted this scene was simply shot in slow motion in a studio. The floating, jerky movements were telltale signs of rework. The astronauts were allegedly suspended by cables attached to their backs to simulate zero gravity. From primitive computers and stiff gloves to studio lights and suspension cables. However, all of these doubts pale in comparison to their most vital argument: cosmic radiation. Earth's magnetic field acts as a natural shield, blocking most of the dangerous radiation from the sun and space. But once you leave this protective layer, radiation exposure spikes dramatically. To reach the moon, the astronauts had to fly through the Van Allen radiation belt, an area trapping high-energy particles. Some argued this radiation was strong enough to fry equipment and even threaten lives. This begged the question: could humans safely pass through this zone in the relatively thin hull of the Apollo spacecraft? Even after clearing the belt, the danger wasn't over. Solar flares can release massive amounts of radiation in a short time. These events are strong enough to disrupt satellites and power grids on Earth. In space, they are a direct threat to human life. A commonly cited example is that 3 months after the Apollo 16 mission, a massive solar flare was recorded. If astronauts had been in space at that time, the results would have been catastrophic. Skeptics argue that Apollo simply didn't have the shielding to survive such scenarios. They also compared it to modern times. Look at NASA's Artemis program today, the project to return humans to the moon and beyond. Researching radiation shielding remains a top priority and is incredibly complex. If we are still struggling to find solutions today, what did humanity rely on over 50 years ago to guarantee absolute safety? This wasn't just about pictures or equipment anymore. This was about humanity's biological limits in deep space. With all this evidence, skeptics reached their conclusion. The moon landing was impossible. Everything was faked. But if it was all a giant play, why? Why would the US government gamble its entire reputation just to direct a sci-fi movie? Because theorists say they had no other choice. World War II had just ended, and before humanity could even celebrate, they were plunged into a tense standoff between two superpowers. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic bomb much earlier than US intelligence predicted. The arms race exploded, from hydrogen bombs to radioactive nuclear tests. Then the race shifted to the sky. In 1957, the Soviet satellite Sputnik was launched into orbit. This dealt a massive blow to American pride. The fear of being attacked from space loomed over Washington, leading to the creation of NASA in 1958. Initially, there was no clear finish line. Each side just tried to one-up the other. From 1961, President Kennedy pushed to change that.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
But reality was harsh. Every major first in space seemed to belong to the Soviets, while the US had a rough start. Rockets exploded on the launch pad, and test flights failed consecutively under fierce media criticism. Vice President Lyndon Johnson conducted a public opinion survey involving multiple agencies. The conclusion showed that the US could surpass the Soviet Union with a strong enough effort. The proposed solution was to put a man on the moon. To achieve this, the US launched a long-term strategy. Among these was the Mercury program, aimed at developing safe flight technology and studying human adaptability in extreme environments. From 1961 to 1963, multiple flights were conducted, completing 6 manned missions. Following Mercury was the Gemini program, with the spacecraft redesigned to carry 2 astronauts. These flights took place from 1964 to 1966. They improved spacecraft controls, docking, and spacewalks. One mission lasted for 2 continuous weeks, a duration sufficient for future lunar landings. By 1967, the race was brutal. 3 American astronauts died in the Apollo 1 fire. Months later, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov died when his Soyuz 1 parachute failed. But the sky wasn't the only thing burning. Down on Earth, the US was sinking into its worst modern crisis. The Vietnam War was spiraling into despair. The economy was buckling, and public trust had hit rock bottom. To conspiracy theorists, this suffocating environment was the exact motive the US needed to take a desperate gamble. Kennedy's deadline to reach the moon before the decade ended hung over NASA's head like a guillotine. If they failed, America's image would collapse globally. The government needed a symbolic victory to sweep away political scandals, calm the angry masses, and restore national faith. Time was up, and technology was limited. So, if they couldn't go to the moon, why not bring the moon down to Earth? The final chosen script: Hollywood intervention. The Apollo program had a massive budget of nearly $30 billion, enough money to fake anything on the planet. That's when Stanley Kubrick's name popped up. In 1968, just a year before Apollo 11, Kubrick released his cinematic masterpiece 2001, A Space Odyssey. His filmmaking techniques recreated zero gravity and lunar landscapes so realistically it was eerie. Many firmly believe the US government secretly approached the genius director. The result, a massive, top-secret movie set. The most suspected location was Area 51, known for its absolute isolation and strict security. Furthermore, the dry lake beds and desert surroundings looked suspiciously similar to the lunar surface the public was shown. Another proposed location was the Lookout Mountain Air Force Station Laboratory in Hollywood, situated right in the heart of Los Angeles. Skeptics argued that this was essentially a military film factory. Others pointed to Cinder Lake in Arizona. It was exactly at this location that NASA actually used explosives to create hundreds of artificial craters. The purpose was to simulate the jagged lunar surface and train astronauts. Perhaps they conveniently turned this practical training ground into the official movie set. These theories sound perfect and intriguing. However, the truth cannot hide from the lens of science. Let's start with the skeptics' proudest evidence: the photos. The missing stars in the lunar sky weren't a stupid mistake by NASA. The short answer is, the cameras on the moon weren't set up to capture starlight. Most of the photos were configured to prioritize much brighter objects. To understand this, you need to know how camera exposure works. When light passes through the lens onto the film, it creates an image. But lighting varies. Photographers must adjust two things: the aperture, how wide the lens opens, and the shutter speed, how long it stays open. If you let in less light or shorten the time, the image gets darker. It's just like how our pupils shrink in bright sunlight and dilate in the dark. Before snapping a picture, the photographer has to decide what the main subject is. Generally, the brighter the object, the less light you want the camera to record. Otherwise, the photo gets blown out and overexposed. You have to remember that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed during the lunar morning. To clearly capture the bright lunar surface and white spacesuits, the cameras were dialed down to reduce light intake. As a result, the astronauts looked crisp, but faint light sources like stars were way too dim to register on the film. If you take a camera out to a blazing bright desert on Earth and photograph the sky, you won't see any stars either. What about the intersecting shadows? People forget what the moon's surface is actually made of. Lunar dust is highly reflective. The uneven sloped ground acted like thousands of giant reflectors, bouncing scattered light in all directions. Combine that with the effect of perspective, flattening a 3D space into a 2D photograph, and parallel shadows look like they are intersecting. Conclusion: there were no studio lights. That bright glow on Buzz Aldrin and the shadows? That's just light bouncing off the lunar surface. What about the waving flag? This classic detail is actually the clearest proof they were in space. NASA knew the moon had no wind, so they built a horizontal metal rod into the top seam to keep the flag extended. When Neil Armstrong twisted the pole into the hard dirt, that twisting force traveled up into the fabric. On Earth, air resistance quickly stops a flag from moving. But in a vacuum, kinetic energy is preserved. Because there was no air to stop it, the flag kept shaking for a long time, creating the illusion of wind. And the infamous rock with the letter C. That marking never existed on the original photo. It was just a cropped section of a larger image. If you look at the original, there is no letter there. Most likely, a stray hair or a piece of lint got caught in the equipment during the photo duplication process. What about the slow motion, floating movements? There is a physical reality that no Hollywood director in the 1960s could fake: the speed of falling dust. Watch closely as lunar dust gets kicked up by Aldrin's boots. On Earth, dust billows up and hangs in the air because of atmospheric resistance. But in the vacuum of the moon, those dust particles fall back down in a perfect arc at the exact same speed as a rock. Why the kangaroo hop? That was simply the most efficient way to move, combining the moon's low gravity, 1/6 of Earth's, with the stiff spacesuit design. In a vacuum, the pressure inside the suit balloons out, making the knee and hip joints incredibly stiff. Hopping was the best way to get around when you couldn't bend your knees properly. As for taking photos in those bulky suits, the astronauts had custom-modified Hasselblad 500 cameras mounted directly to their chests. They didn't have to hold them. They just aimed their bodies and pressed a very large button. Let's put the easily misunderstood photos aside, because to prove the landing was real, we don't just have pictures. We have what they brought back and what they left behind. Across 6 landing missions, astronauts brought back 382 kilograms of lunar rocks and soil. This is the fatal blow to the conspiracy theory. Skeptics claim NASA just picked up meteorites in Antarctica to fool the world. This is laughable because they could never fool the thousands of independent geologists worldwide. Upon analyzing these samples, scientists found microscopic glass beads formed by the extreme heat of meteorite impacts. Most importantly, These rocks contain traces of cosmic radiation, something that can never be produced or preserved on Earth due to our atmosphere blocking it out. Moon rocks are completely devoid of water and have never been weathered by oxygen. Faking a rock like this in an Earth lab is physically impossible. And if the rocks aren't enough, look at what they left behind. Laser retroreflectors. These devices are still working right at this very second. Any independent observatory in the world can shoot a laser pulse at those exact coordinates on the moon and catch the reflection to measure the distance between the Earth and the moon down to the centimeter. What about the deadly Van Allen radiation belt? Yes, it is full of high-energy particles that can be lethal with prolonged exposure. But the Apollo spacecraft didn't fly straight through the deadliest part like people imagine. Scientists understood the belt's structure perfectly. It wasn't a solid wall of death. It was shaped like two donuts around the Earth, with stronger and weaker zones and even a gap in between. NASA calculated an incredibly precise trajectory. They completely bypassed the most dangerous inner belt and only clipped the edges of the outer belt where radiation is weaker, flying at a specific angle to dodge high-density areas. As a result, Apollo 11 spent only about 30 minutes passing through the outer belt, and just 10 minutes in the strongest radiation zone. In total, they were in the belt for about an hour. Furthermore, the aluminum hull and internal equipment acted as a shield. The actual radiation dose was measured. The Apollo 11 crew received about 0.18 rem. A lethal, acute dose requires hundreds of rem. In short, they absorbed radiation, but at a very low, safe level. The ultimate witness, the enemy. The most powerful proof of the moon landing comes from America's biggest enemy at the time. Remember, this was the peak of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had a massive network of intelligence radars and tracking stations pointing straight up into space. They heavily monitored every single signal transmitting from the Apollo spacecraft. If the US was filming in a studio in the Nevada desert, the signals would be coming from Earth. The Soviets had all the technical capabilities to expose that fraud instantly. If they had proof, they would have crushed America's reputation on the front page of every newspaper on the globe. But what happened? There was no whistleblowing. The Soviet Union remained completely silent. And the silence of your greatest enemy is the clearest admission of your victory. Ultimately, the biggest hole in this entire conspiracy theory lies in human nature itself. The Apollo program wasn't the work of a few guys in a dark room. It involved around 400,000 people, from genius scientists to mechanics welding parts. History proves that massive political cover-ups, like Watergate, collapsed just from a few leaked testimonies. So how could the US government force hundreds of thousands of people to keep a world-shattering secret for over half a century? Not a single deathbed confession. Not a single declassified document leaked. The truth is often very simple. When you compare the sheer effort required to silence hundreds of thousands of people, build massive sets, fake space rocks, and trick the Soviet intelligence network, actually building a rocket and sending humans to the moon turned out to be much easier and more logical than maintaining the perfect lie.